So I want to start by acknowledging what everybody knows, that Professor Bartov's appearance at Sonoma State has been the cause of controversy, especially beyond campus. And if you came to today's talk because you heard about the controversy and you want to make your voice heard, I extend a warm welcome to you. You are in a truly extraordinary venue, which is unusual both at Sonoma State and in higher education across the United States. We are in a classroom with open doors. Sitting around you are about 60 students who are taking this lecture series for credit. There's also a sizable group who's joining us today from Santa Rosa Junior College. My students write exams, they do original research, and formulate a research poster to present their findings. Everyone else who is present comes from the community, both here at Sonoma State and beyond. There's also an online audience, which is often quite substantial. So we're happy to share our extraordinary lineup of speakers with all of you. However, because this is a classroom, I have a special request. Please do not attempt to disrupt our event with noise or with signs and banners. We appreciate and respect the strong views that Israel and Palestine elicit. In the Q&A segment following Professor Bartov's talk, we invite you to ask tough questions. Being a respectful participant in a scholarly dialogue about a difficult topic does not require you to check your brain or your conscience at the door. However, if you attempt to prevent Professor Bartov from speaking or being heard, we will ask you to be quiet. If you continue to disrupt, we will ask you to leave. As my mother told me when I was little, the good Lord gave us one mouth, but two ears. Perhaps there's some greater meaning in that. So I would also like to speak directly to my critics. I want to acknowledge that many of you have shared your concerns with me in good faith. I have tried to explain my programming decisions to you. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is indeed a new topic, at least in the public portion of this class. Among our 45 events over the last 3 years, we have devoted 2 talks to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict itself, and an additional 2 events that model for students how they might discuss difficult topics like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I arranged the latter in response to the encampment controversy on this campus in 2024. I emphasize that in the students-only discussion portion of this class, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a new topic. It has been present in readings for more than a decade, long before I took charge of the course. And as students know, our course focuses not only on genocide, but on related topics of war and its associated crimes, on imperialism, on colonialism, and many other topics. Just last week, we sponsored an event on the ethnic cleansing of the Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan. So I also want to be clear that some of the criticism has not been offered in good faith. Reckless accusations that I am guilty of a blood libel against Israel and the Jewish people because I have invited to this lecture series respected scholars like Usama Makdisi and Omer Bartov, misconstrued the meaning of blood libel and evidence the ignorance of those who make such accusations. Worse are threats by persons emboldened and radicalized by these accusations, which are naked attempts to frighten and silence. So these tactics are part of a broad weaponization of anti-Semitism to serve narrow partisan interests. This is occurring in a context where scholarly freedoms are being sharply constrained, and where First Amendment protections for foreign students in American universities are effectively a dead letter. Particularly on the topic of Israel and Palestine. And so tragically, our ability to understand and respond to anti-Semitism suffers because the word is conveniently packaged to suit any political purpose, no matter how far-flung. So the Czech dissident Václav Havel warned of this outcome after the Soviet-led invasion of Prague in 1968. He wrote, "When the duty to name things as they are is superseded by the duty to qualify things ideologically, language itself is degraded." So paradoxically, there is no controversy about the qualifications and stature of our speaker. One of Omer Bartov's critics, writing in the Times of Israel, noted at the outset of a recent rebuttal of Bartov's work, quote, "Bartov's emotional and moral struggle is evident and his credentials are respected. We should all be so polite, even in disagreement." So let me introduce our speaker. Bartov is Dean's Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. He was born in Israel in 1954. His mother's family had roots in Buchach, in present-day Western Ukraine. They migrated to mandatory Palestine in the 1930s. The fate of his mother's hometown in the Holocaust is the subject of Bartov's 2018 book, Anatomy of a Genocide, The Life and Death of a Town Called Buchach. Bartov served as an officer in the IDF during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. He was educated at the University of Tel Aviv and St. Antony's College, Oxford. At risk of stoking even more controversy, I note that St. Antony's is the so-called spy college. Since then, Bartov has made a very successful career here in the United States, first at the Harvard Society of Fellows, then as a faculty member at Rutgers University, and now at Brown University. Along the way, Bartov has authored numerous books and scores of articles on the activities of the Wehrmacht in the Second World War, on the Holocaust, and recently on the turn toward ethno-nationalism in Israeli politics. His most recent book, Israel, What Went Wrong, was just published a few weeks ago by FSG. It is also the title of his talk today. Finally, I want to conclude this introduction by acknowledging that we have had a lot of esteemed speakers stand at this podium over the years, but today might be the first moment when a speaker has appeared at precisely the moment he is in the national media spotlight. We're thrilled that Professor Bartov has joined us today.
Thank you, Stephen, so much. So thank you for this kind introduction. Thank you all for coming here. And some people here online, so thank you for being there too. What I'll try to do in the next 50 minutes or so is to give you an idea of what this book is about. And after that, I hope that we'll be able to have a good, vigorous conversation over this. So the book, Israel, What Went Wrong, explores what I call the tragic transformation of Zionism, a movement that sought to emancipate European Jews from oppression and persecution into a state ideology of ethno-nationalism, increasingly focused on the exclusion and violent domination of Palestinians under Israeli rule. How is it possible, I ask, that a state founded in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust stands today incredibly accused of war crimes, forcible displacement of civilian populations, and crimes against humanity? by what bitter cunning of history have we come to the point that not even 8 decades after the Jewish state was established in 1948, the same year in which the Genocide Convention was adopted by the United Nations, Israel engaged for 2 years in a genocidal undertaking with impunity from the very international legal regime set up after World War II to prevent and punish this crime. And how do we come to terms with the fact that Israel's war of destruction was conducted with wide support, laced with denial and indifference of most of its own Jewish citizens? So the book traces the roots and realities of the violent events that unfolded in Israel and the occupied territories since October 7, 2023. In the final pages of the book and in the final section of my talk today, I tried to sketch out some future scenarios at a time of great uncertainty and confusion. Some would argue that what we watched with shock and horror was the inevitable consequence of Zionist settler colonialism set in motion in the late 19th century. And in part, that is true. But the focus on the functional reality of settlement in Palestine largely misses the ideological and emotional motivations of this movement, as well as the underlying self-perception of generations of Zionist activists and supporters. So what interests me and what makes, to my mind, the history leading to this moment all the more tragic is that the unfolding events can be seen as inevitable only in retrospect. Was this an unavoidable development, or was it the product of particular circumstances and decisions? Was there a crucial moment at which things began turning in one direction rather than another? Can the grim logic of events still be reversed? Or are we observing an unstoppable rush by Israel toward the destruction of others, as well as self-annihilation as a society and state proclaiming democratic and liberal values? So these questions have kept me up at night since the Hamas attack on southern Israel, in which some 800 civilians were massacred and about 250 taken hostage. This event was swiftly followed by a fierce Israeli military campaign of utter annihilation against the Gaza Strip as a whole, in which about 72,000, that's a minimal figure, 72,000 Palestinians were killed, about 80% of them civilians, the majority of them children. At least 10,000 are missing, likely buried under the rubble. And untold thousands of babies, chronically ill persons, and others in need of medical care have become indirect victims of the destruction of Gaza's medical services. Deliberate, I might add. But my concern with the larger context of Israel's identity and relationship to Palestinians is not recent. In a certain sense, as I've come to realize in these last couple of years, it has been part of my own making ever since I can remember myself. And so I'll tell you just a few things about myself. I was born and raised in Israel, a member of the first generation that came into the world following the state's creation. Less typically, my father was also born in what was then mandatory Palestine, shortly after his parents arrived there in the mid-1920s. My paternal grandfather, who grew up in dire poverty in Poland, and was exposed to local anti-Semitism, was a staunch Zionist. My father had to leave school and seek employment at the age of 15 to support the household. 2 years later, he volunteered to join the Jewish Brigade of the British Army. He too was a Zionist throughout his life. His encounter with the survivors of the Holocaust in Europe remained etched on his soul and found expression in several of the novels he subsequently wrote. I actually dedicate my book to my father, and I can explain the dedication later. I dedicate it in loving memory of my father, the last Zionist. I'll be happy to explain what I mean later on. My mother, who was born in Poland, and this was mentioned, came to Palestine with her parents and two brothers at the age of 11 in 1935. Her father, too, was a staunch Zionist and an observant Jew. The family was plunged into poverty upon arrival in the Promised Land. But no one ever complained to my grandfathers about my grandfather's choice to leave Poland, which was growing increasingly unstable, poor, and anti-Semitic. I was born in Israel thanks to my grandfather's decision to leave that land where my family had lived for centuries. Had he stayed, I would likely not have been born at all. As I grew up, I realized that although all families are different, most of those I knew in Israel had one thing in common. They'd lost virtually all their relatives who stayed behind in Europe. I was lucky to have two sets of grandparents, but my father's and my mother's extended families in Poland were all murdered, and none of them came out after the war. We lived in mutilated families, and the sense of loss and mourning was ubiquitous, though rarely articulated. Told that we were the first generation of our people's resurrection, we never questioned our presence, existence, and future in Israel. Yet over time, even as the visible signs of the destruction of Palestinian culture all around us were gradually demolished or covered over, some of us became increasingly aware that our resurrection had come at the price of another people's catastrophe. I was raised in Tel Aviv, in neighborhoods built right next to or over the remnants of Palestinian villages whose residents had fled Israeli troops. I served in the Israeli Defense Forces for 4 years, a term that included the 1973 Yom Kippur War and postings in the West Bank, Northern Sinai, and Gaza, where I saw firsthand the poverty and hopelessness of Palestinian refugees eking out a living in congested, decrepit neighborhoods. At the time, in the 1970s, when I was there, the population of Gaza was about 350,000. Now it's over 2 million. I remember patrolling the shadeless, silent streets of the Egyptian town of El Arish, which was then occupied by Israel, pierced by the gazes of the fearful, resentful population observing us from their shuttered window. For the first time, I understood what it meant to occupy another people. I wrote my Oxford PhD thesis, later published as a book, on the Nazi indoctrination of the German army and the crimes perpetrated on the Eastern Front in World War II. What I found ran counter to the way Germans in the 1980s understood their past. They preferred to think that the army had fought a decent war, anständiger Krieg, even as the Gestapo and the SS perpetrated genocide behind the army's back. It took Germans many more years to realize just how complicit their own fathers and grandfathers had been in the Holocaust and the mass murder of many other groups in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. People tend to forget that in the war against the Soviet Union, about 26 million Soviet citizens died. The majority of them civilians, of whom about 2.5 million were Jews. So there were millions of non-Jews who were murdered by the Nazis in that war. And that figure is rarely mentioned when we talk about Nazi crime. When the first Intifada, or uprising, broke out in late 1987, I was teaching at Tel Aviv University. I was appalled by Minister of Defense Yitzhak Rabin, his instruction to the IDF to, I'm quoting, break the arms and legs of Palestinian youth who were throwing rocks at heavily armed Israeli troops. I wrote a letter to him, cheekily, warning him that based on my research on the indoctrination of the armed forces of Nazi Germany, I feared that under his leadership, the IDF was heading down a similarly slippery slope. To my astonishment, a few days later, I received a one-line response from him, chiding me for daring to compare the IDF to the Wehrmacht, to the German military. But in retrospect, I believe this exchange reveals something about Rabin's own subsequent intellectual journey. For as we know from his later engagement in the Oslo peace process, however flawed, he did eventually recognize that in the long run, Israel would not be able to sustain the military, political, and moral price of the occupation. But of course, he was assassinated in 1995. Since 1989, I've been teaching in the United States. I've spent many years researching the transformation of my mother's hometown, that town of Buchach, then in Poland, now in West Ukraine, from a community of inter-ethnic coexistence into one in which, under the Nazi occupation, the Gentile population turned against their Jewish neighbors. That's after living side by side for 400 years. In the months since October 7th, what I'd learned in the course of my own life and my career became more painfully relevant than ever before. Like many others, I found this to be an emotionally and intellectually challenging period. Like many others, I saw members of my own family and my friends' families directly affected by the violence. There is no dearth of grief wherever you turn. I've always maintained close links with Israel. My parents are buried in the kibbutz where I was born, and my eldest son lives in Tel Aviv with his family, as do most of my best friends. But I now feel increasingly estranged from Israel. It seems to be a different, strange, and threatening place, whose people, including some of my friends, have been transformed, perhaps irretrievably. It is a country trapped in its own sense of shock and trauma, in deep denial of the crimes being committed in its name by its people. Now, there is no understanding of Israel's current predicament without considering its past and the movement that led to a Jewish state. Zionism was the product of the vast transformation of Jewish life in the European diaspora that followed the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the rise of nationalism. Ironically, just as the Jews were coming out of the ghetto, as it was called, and joining the mainstream of European society, they found themselves increasingly associated with all the ills of modernity, urbanization, and the erosion of traditional society. It was under these circumstances, this is in the late 19th century, that modern anti-Semitism was constituted as an ideology and a political platform for the mass mobilization of movements and parties. This led in turn to a Jewish quest to solve the emerging Jewish question. That was the topic of the day, through a variety of political movements, one of which was Zionism. In his 1882 essay, Ode to Emancipation, which has an exclamation mark at the end of the title, the Russian Jewish physician Leon Pinsker described the Jews in the diaspora as a zombie nation, and I'm quoting from his pamphlet. The uncanny form of one of the dead walking among the living, a ghost-like apparition of a living corpse, a people without unity or organization, without a land or other bonds of unity, no longer alive, and yet walking among the living, a spectral form without precedence in history. The ubiquitous fear of the Jewish ghost, he wrote, eventually culminated in Judeophobia, which was his term for anti-Semitism. Zionism then envisioned itself as the only possible answer to this abnormal, perverse condition. Of course, Zionism sought not only to liberate the Jews from persecution, exclusion, and violence, but also to provide them with the same kind of national self-determination that their neighbors had accomplished. But for the Zionists, national liberation could be implemented only outside the territories of mass Jewish habitation in East Central Europe, where they were increasingly unwanted. Instead, Zionism envisioned the Jews' religious, historical, and mythical ancestral land as the site where the newly declared Jewish nation will be resurrected. That intended resurrection took shape in parallel with mounting persecution and eventual genocide. As the expanding Jewish community in Palestine began creating the infrastructure for a future state under the aegis of the British Empire, this is the British mandate of the interwar period, practicing all the familiar processes of a settler colonial takeover of land and resources from the indigenous Palestinian population, millions of Jews who remained in Europe were first discriminated against and persecuted, and later murdered by the Nazis and their numerous European collaborators. In the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust, an exhausted Britain thought to abandon its increasingly burdensome rule in Palestine, while the international community leaned more than ever before towards supporting the creation of an independent Jewish state. The bitter war that followed between the Jews and the Palestinians, who rejected the United Nations partition plan for Palestine as unfair and unjust, which it was, supported by the invasion of several Arab armies, ended up in a Jewish victory and a Palestinian catastrophe. Seeking to ensure a solid Jewish majority, this was the aim of Zionism, to create a Jewish majority state, Jewish forces during the fighting expelled most of the Palestinian population, which had previously constituted 2/3 of the country's inhabitants, from the territories they came to control. These two traumatic events, the Holocaust and the Nakba, the violent mass displacement of the Palestinians in 1948, are inextricably linked historically, personally, and as part of the politics of memory. And they've respectively become constitutive of Israeli and Palestinian national identity. The year 1948, therefore, saw both the establishment of the Jewish state, perceived as the answer to the Holocaust, and the uprooting of Palestinian civilization from Palestine. On the 14th of May, 1948, as the British mandate was about to expire, the Jewish People's Council in Palestine promulgated a declaration of the establishment of the State of Israel, popularly known in Israel as the Declaration of Independence. It's not clear independence from whom, because the British were leaving anyway, but that's the way it's remembered as the scroll of independence in Israel. Ironically, even as hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were being expelled simultaneously, the document included a series of lofty assurances of equality and justice to all citizens of the state, regardless of ethnicity, creed, and gender. The declaration set a deadline of October 1st, 1948, for a constitution that would provide the legal framework for the state's institutions and the nature of its regime. But no constitution was ever adopted, and the legal status of the declaration remains disputed. As Israel evolved without a constitution reflecting its the democratic and liberal principles of the Declaration of Independence, themselves really imposed by the UN. The declaration was in response to demands from the UN for admission into the United Nations. Zionism itself transformed from a movement of Jewish self-emancipation, individual transformation, self-determination, and freedom from persecution and anti-Semitism into a state ideology. Whereas before 1948, Zionism presented two faces, one of liberation from oppression and the other of settler colonialism and ethno-nationalism. Once the state was established, the latter came to dominate Israeli politics. Not unlike other political concepts and philosophies, such as socialism or fascism, that changed dramatically as they took over states, Zionism began to transform as soon as it became Israel's official ideology. Arguably, a constitution based on the progressive principles of the Israeli Declaration of Independence would have served to constrain the worst impulses of Zionism. It might have prevented, at a minimum, limited the reach of the military rule imposed on Israel's Arab citizens, those 150,000 who remained, between 1948 and 1966. It might have also facilitated the process of repatriation for part of the Palestinian population that had fled or was expelled in 1948. Instead, as time went on, the focus on Zionism as state ideology determined that in the competition between being Jewish and being democratic, the state tilted increasingly toward the former. First, in the sense of a state strictly for Jews, for ethnic Jews, and then in becoming ever more a Jewish state that is more and more religious. This was a long process and never an inevitable one. One mechanism that came to play an important role in the transformation of Israel into what it has become in recent years was its politics of memory and commemoration. In the wake of World War II and the Holocaust, memorials went up everywhere, proclaiming a commitment to never let such inhumanity happen again. But there was no universal consensus over what it was that would never be repeated, since the Holocaust as a historical event was already over. There were those who pledged never to let genocide occur again. In Israel, however, the pledge was interpreted differently, to mean never again any genocide of Jews. In its early years, when I was still going to school in Israel, Israel was uncomfortable with the legacy of the Shoah as an event in which millions allegedly, as was the line in Israel at the time, went like sheep to the slaughter. But starting with the trial of Adolf Eichmann in the early 1960s, and especially since the 1980s, when Israeli politics swung increasingly to the right, the Holocaust became a glue binding together diverse and at times hostile sectors of the Jewish population. The religious and the secular, the young and the old, the Mizrahi population from North Africa, the Middle East, and the Ashkenazi Jews. And over time, as the genocide of the Jews came to play a growing role in Israeli public life and rhetoric, it was no longer perceived merely as a past event, but also as a future, indeed potentially imminent threat. This made for the creation of a collective mentality, both fragile and aggressive, created as a haven for the Jews that would shield them from anti-Semitic violence. Israel began to perceive itself as always being threatened with extinction, even as its regional military superiority became increasingly unchallenged. This fear of another Auschwitz also provided license for exercising disproportionate violence against anyone perceived as threatening the existence of the state. At the same time, the argument that during the Holocaust, the nations of the world had stood by rather than coming to the rescue of the Jews was employed to assert that when under threat, Israel had no obligation to accept any international norms, since its priority had to always remain focused on preserving its bare existence at any cost. Another crucial element in the transformation of Israeli society over time is the occupation of Palestinian territories in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip that followed the 1967 war. For most of its existence, 59 out of 78 years that have passed since its establishment, Israel has controlled lands that lie outside its borderlines, established in the armistice of 1949, and contain large numbers of Palestinians. Taking in the full picture, today, 7 million Jewish Israeli citizens in effect now rule over 7 million Palestinians, of whom 2 million are Israeli citizens whose rights are restricted in myriad ways by the state, while 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank and 2 million in the Gaza Strip have practically no rights at all. In the view of most Israeli citizens, those Palestinians do not even have the right to have rights. This ongoing occupation has had numerous effects on the country's politics, mentality, and norms. With time, the occupied Palestinians underwent social death as far as Jewish Israeli citizens were concerned, hidden behind the complex of separation wars, fences, bypass roads, and checkpoints. When Jewish citizens encountered occupied Palestinians, it is often as soldiers enforcing the occupation. In this role, the conduct is meant to show who is the boss, breaking into people's homes in the middle of the night or humiliating Palestinians seeking to move across their lands to get to their jobs, schools, or hospitals through endless checkpoints. The occupation has thus dehumanized the occupied and the occupiers alike. In his 1950 essay, Discourse on Colonialism, the Martiniquais poet, author, and politician Aimé Césaire insightfully noted, and I'm quoting him, colonization works to decivilize the colonizer, to brutalize him in the true sense of the word, to degrade him, to awaken in him buried instincts, to covetousness, violence, race hatred, and moral relativism, a process whereby regression takes place and gangrene sets in. A center of infection begins to spread, so that at the end of all these punitive expeditions that have been tolerated, all these prisoners who have been tied up and interrogated, all these patriots who have been tortured, at the end of all the racial pride that has been encouraged, all the boastfulness that is being displayed, a poison has been distilled into the veins of the country, and slowly but surely it proceeds toward savagery. This is the process we've seen in Israel, most prominently with the settlement project, which has now brought some 750,000 Jews into the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, creating an apartheid regime whereby 3/4 of the population in these territories live under an arbitrary military legal system, and the remaining fourth enjoy all the rights and privileges of Jewish Israeli citizens. So the October 7th, 2023 attack by Hamas and the Israeli military operation in Gaza that followed cannot be understood without taking into account the larger historical context. The precise timing of the Hamas attack was likely precipitated by domestic disarray that had to do with the protests against a judicial coup in Israel that started in January 2023, and fears that the Palestinian issue was about to disappear completely from the international agenda, and that had to do with negotiations between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the US on the eve of October 7th to normalize the relations, open trade to India, and so forth. But the deeper reason for the attack was the growing despair of the population in the Gaza Strip that had lived under an Israeli siege for the previous 16 years, whose livelihood, education, health, and prospects appeared increasingly dismal. Subsequently, the brutal Hamas attack deeply humiliated the IDF, instilled a sense of profound insecurity in the Israeli civilian population, and exposed the incompetence of the government. It also enraged a Jewish public that had grown used to thinking of Palestinians as people who could easily be cowed into submission. The response was like that of other colonial systems when confronted by indigenous resistance, a desire to pulverize the rebels into submission, and an assertion that the very savagery of the massacre proved the need to exterminate all the brutes. That's quoting Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness about colonialism, colonial rule in Congo. If we are to make sense of the Israeli public's astonishing indifference to the massive death toll in Gaza, however critical many Israelis may be of their government and army, we must understand that when the former Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, called Hamas, and by extension, the rest of the population in Gaza, human animals, he reflected sentiments held by the majority of the population. These sentiments flared after October 7th, but in point of fact, were long prevalent among Jewish Israeli citizens as a result of the largely normalized occupation. I'm quoting Césaire again here. Colonization, he writes, dehumanizes even the most civilized man, since it is based on contempt for the native and justified by that contempt. So that the colonizer, who in order to ease his conscience, gets into the habit of seeing the other man as an animal, accustoms himself to treating him like an animal, and tends objectively to transform himself into an animal. This, as Césaire famously pointed out, is the boomerang effect of colonization, or what he called the choc à retour. There should be little doubt that the Hamas attack the massacre of hundreds of civilians, including children and the elderly, as well as reported case of rape and other kinds of abuse, and the taking of hostages is a war crime and a crime against humanity. It is also the case, however, that resisting oppression and dehumanization, including by force of arms, is not only understandable, but also legal under international law, especially when it forms part of a struggle for national self-determination. I should mention, of course, that in Israel, there's a great deal of admiration for resistance by Jewish resistance groups, whether in Europe during the war or against the British in the years preceding 1948. And those groups, the Irgun, Etzel, Lehi, those underground groups are greatly celebrated. We can condemn the barbarity of the attack, yet recognize the right to resist occupation, at least when it's directed against legitimate military targets. On July 19th, 2024, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, ruled in its advisory opinion to the UN General Assembly that Israel's occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip was illegal. Consequently, it ruled, I'm quoting, Israel has an obligation to bring an end to its presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible. But beyond such legal rulings, it should be recognized that resistance is also the most basic act of human self-assertion by the oppressed. As the former slave, writer, orator, and social reformer Frederick Douglass movingly noted in his memoir when describing his fight with a slave owner who tried to whip him. He writes, "This was the turning point in my life as a slave. It rekindled in my breast the smoldering embers of liberty and revived a sense of my own manhood. I was a changed being after that fight. I was nothing before. I was a man now." For its part, Israel has claimed the right of self-defense in its attack on Gaza. Israel was deeply traumatized by the massacre of October 7th, and its population generally agreed on the need to strike back as a means of self-defense. Indeed, the only legitimate war under international law is one of self-defense. Although given that Gaza is formally an occupied territory, as you just heard, this is not a fully satisfactory argument. Be that as it may, in fighting a legal war does not legitimize severe breaches of international law. Just as the right to resist does not legitimize the massacre of civilians. As it turns out, Israel's war was not merely an attempt to destroy Hamas and release the hostages, as the government proclaimed, both of which it failed to achieve by military means. The hostages were mostly freed through negotiations and return of Palestinian prisoners, and Hamas is, of course, still around. In fact, from the very first day of its response to the Hamas attack, Israel acted in ways that hardly fit those goals, because the far-right elements supporting Netanyahu, and increasingly the prime minister himself, actually viewed October 7th as an opportunity to eliminate the Palestinian issue in Gaza altogether under the guise of self-defense. That Israeli officials declared an intention or an intent which the government set about implementing to systematically destroy Gaza, in line with numerous statements by politicians and military officers with executive authority, which threatened to flatten Gaza and to deprive its population, among whom it was said there were no uninvolved people, of food and water. The IDF also went about demolishing the vast majority of the educational, cultural, and health facilities in Gaza. This clearly demonstrated its goal not only of destroying Hamas and its capacity to govern, but also of making the entire area uninhabitable and depriving the population of everything that makes for group identity and continuity. In other words, Israel declared its intention and then engaged in an attempt to destroy the Palestinian people in Gaza in whole or in part as such, thereby reaching the high bar of the Genocide Convention. Now, I reached this conclusion after considerable deliberation between October 2023 and May 2024. Much more proof has accumulated since then, following the IDF's ethnic cleansing operations in northern Gaza beginning in October 2024, as well as after Israel unilaterally broke the ceasefire in March 2025, imposing a total hold on humanitarian aid and emptying vast areas of the Gaza Strip of the civilian population. Disturbingly, this genocidal operation was carried out with almost complete impunity and has thus also threatened the continued existence, or at least relevance, of the entire international legal edifice that was put together after World War II. The country most, the country most responsible for allowing the continuation of this undertaking was and remains the United States, without whose constant military and political support, the fighting would have ended much sooner. The United States could have worked instead toward a deal that would have enabled the return of the hostages, the return of the Hamas leadership from Gaza, the installation of a different Palestinian Authority in the territory, and the launching of a political process geared toward resolving the conflict through negotiations rather than violence. But the current Israeli government is adamantly opposed to any political settlement with the Palestinians. Until October 7th, Netanyahu preferred having Hamas rule over Gaza as proof that there was no viable political option. Indeed, as early as 2015, Bezalel Smotrich, now Netanyahu's powerful finance minister, referred to Hamas as an asset, invoking precisely the same logic that induced Netanyahu to allow millions of dollars to be delivered via Israel from Qatar to Hamas. As we observe the current situation on the ground, we need to ask ourselves what the possible future scenarios for this devastated region might be, and what implications it will have for the nature of the state of Israel. Will the country persist on the course it is on at the moment, compounding all that has gone wrong with Israeli politics and society in an irreversible plunge into the abyss of authoritarianism, violence, and oppression? Or will it radically change course and set about the long process of repair, reconciliation, and achieving long-delayed but urgently needed justice? I can envision two alternatives. The first is that Israel will persist in its attempt to empty Gaza of its Palestinian population, or, it seems more likely, to subject it to ever more inhumane conditions in the wasteland of what had once been its home. Right-wing pressures to annex parts of Gaza and the West Bank, de facto, if not de jure, may bring about the eventual creation of an even stricter apartheid regime in all or much of the occupied territories. This system will inevitably seep, and is already seeping, into Israel proper, first targeting Palestinian citizens and rendering their citizenship increasingly meaningless, and then also turning against any Jewish citizens who oppose it or oppose the system or fail to conform to its regressive, unjust, and undemocratic norms. As the regime becomes more and more authoritarian, its legal establishment weakens and adapts, and this is happening now on a daily basis, and violence becomes ever more prevalent, Israel will grow isolated and less affluent, a pariah state that Jewish communities around the world will be embarrassed to associate with, even as they will likely also face a growing tide of anti-Semitism. Members of the liberal professions and persuasions will leave, and many of Israel's allies will distance themselves from it, as its claim to be the only democracy in the Middle East will be shown to be nothing more than a farce. This condition could last for a few decades, but is eventually likely to lead to the state's implosion, as transpired in South Africa in 1994. But by then, much blood would have been shed and much suffering endured, and the civil rights struggle that will follow might be just as bloody. The second, more optimistic but less likely scenario is that Israel and the Palestinians will be compelled to change the entire political paradigm under which they've been living since 1948. Among outside actors, only the United States is in a position to use the current tragedy as an opportunity to seek a political solution for the 14 million Jews and Palestinians living between the river and the sea. Such a solution would enable them to share the land within whichever political framework they choose, a binational state, two states, or a confederation, which I can talk more about, sort of the idea that I've adopted. Ensuring equality, justice, and dignity for all. Some opinion polls keep suggesting that even today, this is what most people in Israel and Palestine prefer, but they will support such an option only when it is realistic and presented by reliable, steadfast political leadership, of which there's none right now. The desire for peace on its own is no recipe for diffusing the fear and rage on both sides. A political solution is also what most Sunni Arab countries in the region support, but it can happen only under firm and determined American leadership. Whether the current administration can remain focused on its peace plan, and whatever that peace plan is, we can talk about that, and translate it into long-term concrete steps appears doubtful. Nonetheless, all those who care about Israel and Palestine, as I do, must work toward the second scenario, by whichever means are at their disposal. As a historian, I believe that the first step in building a better future is understanding the hopes and aspirations as well as the errors and sins of the past. It is for this reason that I wrote this book. My goal in this book is neither to praise Zionism and the state of Israel, or the state that it created, or to condemn it. There are many good, thoughtful, creative, and deeply humane people in that land, Jews and Palestinians, who hope for and deserve a better reality from the one that they are currently subjected to. The blanket condemnation or dismissal that fills the air these days does not reflect this far more complex reality. I can only hope that this book and some other books that are coming out these days will contribute to an opening of minds, that in its own small way, it may help reverse the tide of hatred and destruction by allowing us all to understand how we got here in the first place, and perhaps even how we can clamber out of the abyss. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Aiden. You had said something about possible solutions, or not solutions, but rather the state solutions at the end of this, that being a federation or two-state, one-state. Could you elaborate more on the confederation? Because I think that you put a little more emphasis on that last one.
Yeah.
Sure.
Hello, I'm Daisy. I have a question. You mentioned that in July 2024, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, ruled that the occupation of the Gaza Strip is illegal under international law. Does the United States continued provision of military aid to Israel constitute a violation of our own domestic laws and our obligations as a signatory to the Genocide Convention? Thank you.
Hello, thank you once again for coming by. And I just want to ask, you addressed it a little bit at the end about the role of the United States in this whole ordeal. But I wanted to ask, by extension, what does the role of the UN or by any other countries play? And do those other countries have any chance of gaining some significance in this whole ordeal?
And Omer, please explain the dedication to your father as the last Zionist.
I'll start with that. So this is a little bit tongue in cheek, this dedication. My father died in 2016 at the age of 90. And as I said, he was born in Palestine shortly after his parents came there. He was a Zionist through and through. The kind of Zionism that he believed in was completely different from what Zionism has become now. He always tended toward the left. He was a member of Mapam. Any of you will know that he was left wing of the Labour Party, member of Hashomer HaTzair, which was the youth movement, the socialist youth movement of the left-wing Zionism. That's why my parents went to the kibbutz in which I was born, which was a very socialist kibbutz. But he was also a Zionist. And he believed in the right and need of Jews for self-determination and a state of their own. He and I did not agree on many things, and he deeply lamented the fact that I left Israel. It was very hard for him to come to terms with that. But in his last years, he increasingly felt that Israel was moving in a completely in a direction that, to his mind, undermined everything that Zionism was about. And he started calling Netanyahu the wrecker of Zionism. And one example of that that I like to remember is that my father received, he was a writer and a journalist that was quite well known in Israel. He received the Israel Prize, which is the most prestigious prize in Israel. It may become less prestigious because now it is offered to President Trump. Against the law in Israel. It's not legal in Israel. It's supposed to be only for Israeli citizens. But the law is not being the strong part of Israel these days. In any case, he was, and he said that he refused to die until he received that prize. So he received the prize and shortly thereafter he indeed died. But when he came to receive the prize, and he was old and sick, and he was supposed to be handed the prize by the prime minister. And he walked on the stage with his cane, and he walked right past Netanyahu. He did not shake his hand. And there was a bit of a ruckus in Israel. How dare he not shake the hand of the prime minister, who is giving him the prize? And he said he was not getting the prize from the prime minister, he was getting it for his writing. And so there was a deep sense in him that the country was veering in a terrible direction, and that Netanyahu was very much the leading spirit in that, I say, distortion, profound distortion of what he believed was Zionism. Now, one can argue with my father's Zionism. It's not above arguing about, but it was a very different, humane understanding of what that ideology was, both in terms of society, about social equality and justice, and also in terms of relations between Jews and Palestinians. And that understanding of what Zionism as representing what the state was about, creating a state that would be an example for other states rather than a pariah among other states, that has disappeared. And his death in 2016, in many ways, for me, represents the end of that vision. And the fact that Zionism today, as I see it, has no right of existence. Zionism as an ideology, having become complicit in genocide, is an ideology that must be dismantled and consigned to the garbage heap of history. The state of Israel will, of course, remain. And the state exists. It's recognized in the international community. It doesn't need anybody's recognition. It is there. And those who say you have to recognize it, it is there. It has been recognized already. But if it holds on to the kind of Zionism that has been created in the last 2-3 decades, increasingly so, and this kind of Zionism that was used to justify genocide in Gaza, as long as that is the state ideology, it will be rightly a pariah state, and it has to discard that political ideology. Okay, that's about my dad. On confederation, so I'm active with a group called A Land for All. It's a group that was formed about 12 years ago by Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. 1948 Palestinians who were Israeli citizens and Palestinians in the occupied territories. And it tries to square the circle of the issue of Israel-Palestine. The fundamental assumption of this is that the two-state solution, the traditional two-state solution, is defunct. There's no way to resurrect it because of the vast number of settlers who live now in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, who cannot be removed anymore without a civil war, not even a civil war, because the supporters of the settler movement are now in all the nodes of power of the Israeli state, in the military, in the security services, in the secret service. And so these are the people who are supposed to remove the settlers. They won't remove them because they're part of them. So how do you do that? How do you find a way for both groups to accomplish what they want most? And what they want most is self-determination and the right of return. The Jews have it. They've created the state and they have a law of return. The Palestinians don't have one or the other. And so what the Confederation Plan speaks about is creating two states, Palestine and Israel. They would be along the 1967 borders, more or less. But they would make a distinction between citizenship and residence, so that you could be a citizen of one of the states but live in another as a resident. You would vote for the parliament of your state of citizenship, but you could reside in the other state. And the borders would be open borders, and there would be confederate institutions that would regulate the relations between these two entities and the external borders. That means that hypothetically, if you are of Palestinian extraction and live here in Sonoma and want to go back to Palestine, although you're an American citizen, you could go to Palestine. Palestine would presumably have the same law of return as Israel does. That is, you could become easily a Palestinian citizen. As a Palestinian citizen, you could apply then for a residence permit to live where your family has its ancestral roots, let's say in Haifa or in Jaffa or wherever it might be. And if you are a settler living in the West Bank, and the assumption is that if this were done, many of the settlers would leave because many of them came mostly for economic reasons. They were offered compensation, they would leave. They would not want to live in Palestine, but those who do remain could live there. They would be citizens of Israel. They would be residents by permit in Palestine. But if they broke the law, just like Palestinians from Sonoma, if they broke the law in the state where they're residing, they would be deported to their own state. So if you get up in the morning and you want to uproot some olive trees, then you would be deported from that state. But if you behave as a decent citizen or decent resident, then you could remain. So that's a way of trying to create two states that would have what they most want, the populations most want, and to have open borders, recognizing that both Jews and Palestinians living there or not living there feel a historical link to many places in that area that may not be part of their state, so that they could go and travel there and visit, but they would be citizens of a particular part of it. Now, is it possible right now? No, it isn't. But the idea is that this can be a workable blueprint for a moment when the political framework would change, and it can change. Things change over time. As I was saying earlier today, I was living in Berlin in 1987. I was in West Berlin, and there was a great big wall in the middle of the city with wonderful graffiti on it. And nobody ever thought that that wall would disappear. And 2 years later, it was gone. And now you can't find it. You don't know where the wall was. Nobody can remember exactly the little markings saying the wall was here. So things can change. I'll say one other thing, that there are people who rightly say that the best solution to this conundrum is one state in which all citizens would be equal. And I think that would be the best. I don't think, and I had once an argument over that with Tony Judd, the late great Tony Judd in 2003, when he published an article about that in the New Review. Not then and not now, most Jews and most Palestinians don't want right now to live in the same state. Now, of course, they are living in the same state. There is only one state, but in that state, Palestinians don't have equal rights. And that's the only way. The occupation is really just a facade. It's one state in which there are people living under different regimes, different types of rule. Some have rights, some have fewer rights, some have no rights. Right now, I don't think that the vast majority of Jews and Palestinians would want to live in the same state. They first of all want self-determination. In the future, if such a confederation were to be created and would be successful, it's possible that it would transform itself over time into one state. But I don't think that it would be a doable first phase. So you can look it up, Google a land for all, and you'll find a lot of information about it. And if you support it, so much the better, because it's not very well known in the country. On the ICJ and illegality, so the US recognizes the ICJ, it doesn't recognize the ICC. The International Court of Justice is part of the UN structure. It was created immediately with the creation of the UN, and the US hypothetically recognizes it. The International Criminal Court, which is the court that has charged both Gallant or has issued arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant, is part of the Rome Statute of 1998, and the US does not recognize it right now. In fact, it's trying to dismantle it. But the ICJ is recognized because it's part of the UN, and the United States would have to remove itself from the UN not to recognize the ICJ. But what does it mean? So the ICJ can issue rulings. It does two things, the ICJ. One is a dispute between states. So South Africa claimed to have a dispute with Israel over whether Israel is committing genocide or not. That's the way it was presented by South Africa to the International Court of Justice. And the International Court of Justice will eventually rule on whether Israel committed genocide or not. but it's a court. And just like courts in this country, you can say that somebody is guilty and should go to jail, but the judges cannot go and arrest the person. You need the police for that. And so the enforcement arm of the UN, of which the ICJ is the court, is the Security Council. And in the Security Council, there are 5 permanent members since World War II, since the creation of the UN. One of them is the US. And permanent members have veto power. And the US has used its veto power repeatedly to protect Israel from any sanctions to be imposed by that enforcement arm of the UN, the Security Council. It's the same, by the way, regarding Russia's criminal war in Ukraine. Russia is also a permanent member, has veto power, so the ICJ can rule whatever it likes over Russia's war in Ukraine, but the Security Council cannot act because Russia uses its veto power. So that's the problem with the international system. Domestically, yes, of course. I mean, domestically, both the US and many European countries, not least Germany, are in violation of their own domestic laws by supplying Israel with vast amounts of arms. The US between 70 and 80%, Germany between 20 and 30% of arms flowing to Israel. And that's why these governments will not concede that Israel is engaged not only with genocide, but other severe breaches of international law, because that flies in the face of their own domestic laws that don't allow them to supply arms to countries that are engaged in such breaches of the law. So it's really a political decision. The mechanism is there. Eventually, it will probably be activated, but it'll be for political reasons. My view is that the US will, in fact, increasingly distance itself from Israel and stop this automatic supply of mass arms for its own reasons, not necessarily for moral reasons, but that's more in the realm of speculation. On the UN, what did I write to you? Other countries. Oh, yes. So, yes, look, I mean, the UN, as I already explained, cannot act against what Israel is doing without the Security Council agreeing to do so. So the General Assembly can vote to stop the fighting, can condemn Israel, but when it goes to the Security Council, everything stops. Other countries, that is the main problem, that the main countries that presented themselves and have presented themselves since 1945 as the main protectors of the rule of international law and human rights are the same countries that refuse to, since October 2023, refuse to condemn Israel. Germany, France, Britain, and so forth, and of course the United States. That's first of all endangering the whole system of international law. It's also, I would say, what it creates is a situation where there's one state that is treated exceptionally. So many of the protectors of Israel argue that why is Israel being subjected to different standards? The reality of it is exactly the opposite. There's only one state since 1945 that has been a series of genocide, that is a state that was supported by Western countries and the United States. There are many other countries that engage in horrific crime. They go to Somalia and Myanmar and Russia and China and so forth, yes. But none of them is being supplied by arms and provided with political support from Germany, France, Britain, and the US. the only country that is engaged in obvious breaches of international law and is supported economically, militarily, and politically by those who claim to be protectors of that system is Israel. And that's a novelty. And it is, in that sense, really threatening the entire system that was created to prevent such events from ever happening again after World War II.
In 1975, I was a senior here at Sonoma State. And in that year, the UN passed a resolution equating Zionism as being a form of racism. And at that time, I thought that was completely outrageous. And of course, my views have evolved, and I think differently now. Taking yourself back to 1975, at that time, would it have been fair? Was that UN resolution clear?
Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. You had mentioned that your dad had lamented your departure from Israel. And for fear of this being too maybe forward of a question, I'm curious if you maybe feel he had a point in some way, if maybe there was some value in you, again, not to diminish the work you're doing here, but if there was any value in you staying in Israel to educate when you wanted there.
My name is Stan Rudman. The thing is, you have Israel doing everything wrong, but you seem to forget that the Palestinians and the Arab leaders all around have made mistakes too over the last 80 years, and it caused a lot of problems. And in fact, Israel has responded to these attacks is what is developed. Always they're responding to attacks. And that's it seems like you've forgotten that. And secondly, I hate to say this, but if your own family is against your ideas, you need to point out to the whole students that your views are really a minority of what's happening in Israel.
Okay, well, Zionism is racism. So first of all, I remember that too, of course. And at the time I was at Ford, I guess like you, of course, Zionism and racism, that's a distortion. Just like there were many accusations against Israel of genocide. I was engaged in an argument about 15 years ago with a British sociologist, Shaw, who claimed that 1948 that the Nakba was a genocide. And I argued that I don't think it was, that it was ethnic cleansing, but it was no genocide, and there are distinctions between those. So at the time, yes, I was appalled. Today, I think that Zionism has evolved in that direction. And that's a very sad statement. In 1975, there were already signs of that. You can go and read some of the texts that were being issued already then by settlers. There was a publication called The Point that had some horrific racist materials in it. About purity of blood, about associating with Arabs. There's some reading quasi-Nazi stuff. It was the time of Rabbi Kahana, who was a racist. As Leibovich, Professor Leibovich talked about it, Judeo-Nazi. So these were despicable people, but they were still a minority, and Kahana was outlawed in Israel. His party was outlawed as racist by the Supreme Court. Now, the Minister of National Security is a disciple of Kahana. So the transformation has been profound. And I think there was always a potential because all ethno-nationalisms, and that's what Zionism was, an ethno-national movement, has this potential of becoming ethnically violent and could become racist. By now, Jewish supremacy is part of Zionist ideology, as it is now the ruling ideology in Israel. So whether that was inevitable, I don't believe in determinism in history, but that's what happened. for me, this is a tragedy. The people will say, well, we always knew. I'm not sure. And again, going back to my father's generation, or just him, they would have been totally disgusted with what they see has happened to what is now called Zionism, which is in large part a Jewish supremacist ideology. So yeah, that's on on yes, on me leaving Israel. You know, I often say there's a song in Israel that is what you see from here, you don't see from there. So had I stayed in Israel, I probably would not have the same views that I have now. And that's just the nature of things. I do have friends and colleagues in Israel who are much braver than I am because they live there and they go to the West Bank to try and protect Palestinian shepherds and get beaten up by settlers and IDF soldiers. And most of them are older because the older people are actually more moderate than the younger generation. And I don't know if I would have had the guts to do that. But they're a very small minority, a tiny minority. So I don't know what would have happened had I stayed. And I'm afraid that what I see in Israel, and I have to admit that I might well have been part of it, is either indifference, denial, profound denial, or complicity. Well, it's all of those. And that's a dilemma. A state that is engaged in such actions, especially a state engaged in genocide. Genocide is not something, it's not like a war crime. A war crime can be carried out by some rogue unit and some commander. And then you can find that unit, you court-martial these people, you punish them, but they don't necessarily reflect the country. Genocide is a social event. Everybody becomes involved. You think about Israel today. What have you heard from from members of the bar in Israel? From the Association of Doctors in Israel, from the Association of Teachers in Israel, of psychologists in Israel? Nothing. From the vast majority of faculty, tenured faculty members in Israel, nothing. So, and complicity, which is what such states want and generate, because then everybody is guilty, is the characteristic of such an event. And it will take decades for Israelis to concede, to admit what happened, what was done in their name by their children. I mean, the reason that I mentioned, the German army here is that it's the same thing. I mean, I have friends who are sort of left-leaning and didn't really want to support any of that, but their children were there. How can you think of your children carrying out war crimes? There was a story that I was told last time I was in Israel of a left-leaning mother whose son returns from 7 months in Gaza, and she invites him, well, he comes to a Friday dinner, and he walks in and he says, "Mom, you have no idea what's happening in Gaza." And she says to him, "I don't want to know." That's the kind of deep denial. So I might well have been part of that. I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised. On Israel always being attacked and the Arabs being at fault and always responding. Yes, Israel has been attacked and has responded, but one has to understand what I was trying to say here. When Jews started settling in Palestine, the Zionist slogan was a land without a people to a people without a land to a land without a people. When they arrived, lo and behold, there were actually people living there. And the problem was what to do with that. And often Zionism tried to ignore it. They tried to say, well, we'll see what happens in the future. Enough of us will come and we'll become a majority. And or try to think about the Palestinians as people like Bedouin. They can live here, they can live there. They can move to other Arab countries. Why are they living here? So there was a sort of attempt not to think about it too much, to ignore it. But the growing settlement in Palestine naturally created a conflict because people don't like their lands being taken over. They don't like other people coming in and treating them as primitive, as savages, which is very much how Zionists, especially coming from Europe, Jews in Europe were seen as Oriental. Part of anti-Semitism was to say Jews don't belong here. When the Jews came to Palestine, they became European. They started behaving like they were the paragons of European culture, and the Arabs were these primitive falahs, these peasants. So the conflict was built into that situation, and Israel, over time, on its own, and with a great deal of support from Europe and the United States, became overwhelmingly more powerful than certainly the Palestinians and then increasingly other Arab states. For the last 20 years at least, the major Sunni Arab states want peace with Israel. They don't want conflict with Israel. Saudi Arabia talked about it 20 years ago. Israel signed agreements with the Gulf states. They don't want conflict. Israel has peace with Jordan and Egypt. There's one problem that Israel refuses to recognize and that Arab countries will insist on for their own safety and security of these regimes. These are not democratic regimes, and that is the Palestinians. And Israel refuses to come to terms with the fact that, as I said, there is one country in which there are 7 million people who are under the boot of the other 7 million people. As long as it doesn't resolve that issue, we cannot complain about resistance. I would resist. I talked with Israeli army officers who all say the same. They say, if I were Palestinian, I would also take up arms. There's a famous speech by Moshe Dayan. I cite it in the book. Moshe Dayan was the one-eyed general, the big hero. In 1956, one Israeli guard of a kibbutz that had just been established, Nachal Oz, which is right next to the Gaza Strip. Across the fence, there's Shujaiya, which was a very large Palestinian refugee camp, but really a city. So one guard was kidnapped by Fadaim, by Palestinian resistance fighters, killed. His body was mutilated, and then it was returned by the UN. And Dayan came there to sort of hold a speech at the funeral. He was then chief of staff. And his speech is very famous in Israeli annals. And it's used both by the left and by the right in Israel. And what he says in the speech, he starts the speech by saying, we should not be angry at the people living across the fence for wanting to kill us, because they see us working their fields that we took from them. And they hate us for that. So that was a very sincere expression. And then his conclusion is, and that's why we should always carry a gun in one hand as we're plowing the land. So his conclusion is this kind of tragic notion of history. Yes, we took over the land, and that's why they will hate us and try to kill us. And what do? We'll just carry guns and kill them instead. Now, he changed his mind over time, and he wrote a book about making peace with Egypt 20 years later. But that logic is built into an Israeli refusal to accept the fact that as long as you don't share the space, as long as you say the space is mine, and you can either be tolerated barely or just leave, this conflict will not go away. And it is ultimately a result of the Jewish return, colonization, whatever you want to call it, to Palestine and the taking over of other people's land. That is something that is at the core of the entire conflict.
Thank you very much for a very engaging lecture. Thank you. My name is Rami Markawi. What I wanted to ask you is this shift in public opinion that I feel is happening in the U.S. Is it happening? Do you agree? Do you see, especially among the youth, do you see a fundamental change happening to the public opinion about the whole question, Palestine, Israel, and American support towards Israel? And if that shift is here, and do you think it has a staying power? And if it does have staying power, let's say midterms coming up, elections thereafter, and maybe the numbers of lawmakers in the Senate, the House, so on and so forth, start skewing towards seeing the world for what it is, a little more balanced, right? So if the natural thought would lead towards America's support, unconditional support to Israel, starts winning down or becomes conditional, what do you think Israel's plan would be at that time? Is the shift towards India, would that, I read a lot about Israel going towards India. Is that real? Could it substitute, or do you see America just no way ever will force Israel into some kind of a middle of the road solution?
Todd from the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide at Snow State. I am deeply impressed with your father's Zionism because when I was in Israel, I saw that firsthand. And I would like to ask, do you see a capacity in Israel to return to that Zionism? Because I know how beautiful it was. Is there even a will for that amongst enough people in Israel to return to your father's Zionism?
Yeah, thanks. So on the shift in public opinion, yes, I mean, I think we definitely see that. There are many indications that there's a shift in public opinion in the United States and in Europe. It's reflected more in the public than in the political and intellectual and academic elite. But there is a shift. And in democratic countries, such shifts eventually have political repercussions as well. I would say that in the US, the shift is a bit more complex because there's a shift in liberal opinion. More young people being far more critical of Israel, people potential voters of Democrats, and including many young Jews who feel just increasingly uncomfortable, appalled with what Israel is doing. And that, I think, will have an effect on democratic politics. But there's a shift also on the right. And that shift is what I've been following, reflected in statements that were made by people like Tucker Carlson. That's a different shift. That's a shift that says Israel has taken the US by the nose, which it has, by the way. And this is right, leading it to this current war in Iran, which was a complete extraordinary exercise by Netanyahu to get the US to get Trump involved in this completely stupid war. But Beyond that, there's another argument, and the argument is that this is a reflection of Jewish power. This shows the Jews control finance, control politics, control academia, control the media, control Hollywood, and that they're not really American. They are, as Carlson says in an interview with Piers Morgan about two very right-wing Jews, they are not Western. Which the opposite of Western is Oriental, right? So they're Oriental, meaning this is a kind of view that is racist and that is anti-Semitic. And that may grow. And in part, it's a result of the kind of what I see as the extent to which some Jewish organizations and some Jewish donors have become drunk on their own power. To shut down criticism of Israel and claiming that they represent the Jewish community and thereby opening up this kind of world of anti-Semitic discourse in the United States that is always a little bit under the surface. So from that point of view, I think it is not unlikely that the next administration, whether it's Democratic or Republican, will distance itself from Israel. And will bring in more control over what Israel does. Will not automatically send its arms and money. And that will be in response to public opinion on both sides of the political spectrum. I think that would be very good for Israel because it will redefine the limits of Israeli power. The limits of Israeli power are right now determined in Washington, D.C., which means that there are no limits. Because if you are an ally of the United States and the United States gives you a carte blanche, then you can do whatever you like. So Israel has abandoned politics altogether. Its only politics is being bombs that are produced in Albuquerque, 2,000-pound bomb. Once the limits of power are redressed and Israel returns to its natural size, then it will have to start acting politically. And that would be a first stage to actually doing what some Zionist leaders, going back to the second question, did. They were pragmatic. They were often ruthless, but they were also pragmatic. And they knew what their limits were. Right now, that doesn't exist in Israel. For the United States, such a change may not be great. Because if the kind of forces, Kosovo would know what may run the president. These forces won't be turned only vis-a-vis American policy in the Middle East. They will have to do with American society. It have to do with who is in and who is out, who belongs and who doesn't belong. It is a kind of Christian nationalism. And that won't be good for Jews and won't be good for any other minority groups in the United States. Now, whether Israel being put back into its place can then go to India, from India, from China, people spoke about it in the past. And there is, of course, a kind of understanding. Modi and Netanyahu are bosom friends because they have the same idea, right? They want an ethno-national state. It's Hindu nationalism or Jewish supremacy. The same was with Orban or with Erdogan, although they are as if they're enemies, but they have the same kind of idea about politics. But no, I don't think that Israel would be able to have the same kind of freedom of action without massive U.S. support. And once the U.S. begins to change its policies, once the U.S. changes, then Europe will follow. And most people don't know, but Israel's main trading partner is not the U.S., it's the EU. And there are pressures already now in Europe to limit. Israel gets huge amounts of money from the EU for research, from scientific research, military research, technology, and there are already pressures, but if the US changes its policy, then it will be a vast transformation also in terms of European policy vis-a-vis Israel. And that, you know, in a different world, you could imagine that there would eventually be a government in Israel. It's a bit of a, you know, pipe dream, but there will be a government in Israel that would want to repair its relations with the rest of the world. And the way to do that in a post-Netanyahu government would be to hand Netanyahu over to the ICC. That happened with Serbia. Serbia actually handed Milosevic to the tribunal then in The Hague. As a way, because he could never be put on trial in Israel. There's no way that that would happen. So to hand him over. But that's so a long-term prospect, and he may not be alive by then. On the question of whether Zionism can, whether we can have, as Dubček said, you know, from Czechoslovakia, whether we can have Zionism with a human face again. Dubček said that about socialism with a human face. I don't think so. I really don't. I think because the two things that happened after October 7th, and in that what we call the war in Gaza, of course, it wasn't really a war. It was a demolition, destruction of Gaza. The war there ended at the latest in June of 2024. After that, it was just systematic destruction. Two things happened, I think. One is that Zionism became so deeply complicit in that Zionist ideology that I don't think it can be cleaned up again. And that happened to other ideologies that have become totally discredited. The states that had regimes with those ideologies have remained. Even Germany remained after World War II. And Nazism was removed from Germany through various means and not as efficiently as some hoped, but eventually it was gone. Germany remained. But Zionism as an ideology, I think, cannot be revived. The second thing is Israel's reliance on the Holocaust. The Holocaust is the main provider of license. And because of what happened to us, no one is going to tell us what to do to preserve our own purity. You cannot justify genocide with genocide. Genocide is a crime, and nothing justifies it. It doesn't matter. People say, well, Hamas was hiding under the buildings. You can't carry out genocide by saying your enemy is hiding in tunnels. Nothing justifies genocide. And so Israel's reliance on the Holocaust as the main license for its actions, I think, is bankrupt. And that means that the country not only will have to let go of Zionism and create a different sense of what it is as a country for itself, and create maybe what Habermas called Verfassungspatriotismus, patriotism to the Constitution when it has one. Habermas, of course, was looking at the United States for that. So not ethno-patriotism, but patriotism to a set of laws. Not only that, it will have to consign the Holocaust to its rightful place, which is history. It should be commemorated, it should be researched, but it should not provide license for violence. And what the German Chancellor said, Angela Merkel, when she talked about Germany's Staatsräson, Germany's reason of state, is to defend Israel. If your reason of state is to defend a country that is carrying out genocide, then there's something wrong with your conclusions. Germany's Staatsräson should be protecting international law and human rights. And if even Israel does that, then Germany has to point it out, not only because it's the right thing to do, but even if as a state, or as Germany, or as Jewish communities around the world, if you actually care about that place, you should know that when countries engage in genocide, that's not the only thing that happens. The countries themselves become authoritarian, mean, aggressive, violent toward their own citizens. You can't do both. It's a poison. And so if you care about that society, if you want it to heal, then you have to expose it and to condemn it for that. And so, no, I don't think so. And I don't have an alternative ideology. And maybe it doesn't need one. It can just become what people said already in the 1990s, in the early 1990s. Many people in Israel spoke about the country becoming a state of all its citizens. And what was meant by that, not call it a state of all its citizens. What it meant was for Jews and Arabs, Jews and Palestinians. It never agreed on that. And with the assassination of Rabin, this whole notion was thrown out. And the next stage that followed was the law, the basic law of 2018, which is the basic law. The land of Israel is the nation state of the Jews. So no one else has rights, or they have limited rights, or they may be tolerated, but they don't have equal rights. So this whole concept has to be dismantled. Zionism, I think, is too tainted to serve this purpose.